He said to me, he said, "Tony, do you want to fly airplanes or do you want to break airplanes?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to fly airplanes, and I'm working on that. And I've got 2 more years of school." And he said, "Well, hey, it's the Air National Guard. We can waive that." And he wrote me a letter. I went to a board. I was selected. I got commissioned. And then I was a C-130 navigator for about 2 years. I went to pilot training, and I flew C-130s for about 18 years as a pilot. The 176 wing that Danny mentioned was the last 5 years of my career that I commanded in the neighborhood of about 15 to 1,600 airmen, running almost full time.
Let's welcome Brigadier General Anthony Stratton, retired after 37 years in the Alaska Air National Guard, where he led the 176th Wing and flew thousands of hours in C-130s and C-17s. Welcome to the show, sir. Very honored to have a discussion with you today.
You betcha. Thank you very much for having me, Danny. So C-130 Herculeses and C-17 Globemaster 3s.
Great. It's interesting that you have rose through the ranks to become a one-star general, and you stayed as a pilot. So it's interesting to explore that. But before that, you can share your story in your own words, and we'll go from there.
I spent 55 years in the state of Alaska. I joined the Alaska Air National Guard just out of high school. I'd gone to the University of Montana for a year, came home, and in 1990, I went off to basic training at San Antonio, Texas, and then came back as a propulsion systems technician on the C-130 aircraft, working on the propeller and the engine assemblies. I then went to school. I had an awesome mentor inside of the prop and engine shop. One day we were there for a drill weekend, our one weekend a month. And he said to me, he said, "Tony, do you want to fly airplanes or do you want to break airplanes?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to fly airplanes, and I'm working on that. And I've got 2 more years of school." And he said, "Well, hey, it's the Air National Guard. We can waive that." And he wrote me a letter. And he'd been in the unit for about 18 years. He was a senior non-commissioned officer, and he connected with several of the officers. I went to a board. I was selected. I got commissioned. And then I was a C-130 navigator for about 2 years. I finished my degree, got rid of the waiver. And then I went to pilot training, and I flew C-130s for about 18 years as a pilot. And then we stood up a program that's unique in the Air Force, where we have an association with the regular Air Force and the Air National Guard, where we share the airplanes in the middle. And that's when I went to the C-17 program. I flew that airplane all the way through until my retirement. I've commanded at the squadron level, at the group level, at the wing level, and in joint leadership positions. The wing, the 176 wing that Danny mentioned, that was the last 5 years of my career that I commanded, one of the most diverse wings in the Air National Guard, with multiple mission sets, with air defense, personnel recovery, and strategic airlift, all in the same organization. 6 different weapon systems, and in the neighborhood of about 15 to 1,600 airmen, running almost full time. So for that air defense mission, it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as is the personnel recovery mission. We do about 50% of the personnel recovery for the state of Alaska from a civil search and rescue point of view, hikers, hunters, folks that are out there. And what we found is it was an awesome correlation to building combat skills. So out there over the water at night in the weather, the aviators are able to get all the muscle memory they need without being under the stress of being under small arms fire or being tracked by adversarial aircraft. So then when they are in combat, when they're deploying to Afghanistan and Africa and to Jordan, then they're under that, their muscles already know what to do, right? So now they have extra reactionary space to be able to maneuver the aircraft, keep it safe, and do the mission. We're connected, or I was connected inside of my career, to the Indo-Pacific region. So we were underneath the Pacific Air Forces, as well as the National Guard Bureau, Northern Command for Air Defense, Transportation Command for the C-17 and the C-130 mission sets for airlift, strategic airlift, and those all connected together. And again, another thing that's a little bit unique about me is that I spent my entire, right, a month short of 37 years, like Danny said, inside the same Air National Guard wing. So I came in as an E1 and retired as an 07.
As a person who grew up and lived for a long time in Alaska, Did you ever feel isolated from the rest of the country because, you're far away and geographically it's kind of different and, it's the population isn't huge, or is it kind of just like any other state?
So, as an aviator, I don't think I ever really felt disconnected. I mean, we had weekly missions where we flew the C-17, from Elmendorf right there in Anchorage down to Travis, which is right there in Northern California, right? And I mean, literally, we would do that on a Tuesday, right? And so that part of it, I don't think I felt disconnected. At the senior level in my joint job, I did a lot of planning, and when we did the planning, we kind of viewed Alaska as an island, right? So the logistics routes are completely dependent upon northern Washington and northern California. So if you, like you were mentioning before, there was a small earthquake up there the last couple of days. If there was a major earthquake that affected the West Coast, then it would put the state of Alaska in a very challenging logistics situation. And so that was always in the background. I would say this, Danny, I was born in Montana, but my brother was born in Alaska, but I lived in Alaska, for a long, long time. And most of the folks, the culture in Alaska is very independent. And it's sometimes interdependent. You do work with your neighbors a lot, but you kind of get used to being in an austere place. So, for example, I lived out in Palmer, where we raised both of our adult daughters for 18 years. My driveway was a quarter of a mile long, and I was responsible for the snow removal, right? And it was right up against the 20-acre field, and the wind blew typically 25 miles an hour. And I can tell you, the day that we were able to raise that road up and give it back to the borough, which is kind of similar to counties here in the continental United States, it was a huge blessing because the guy would get out there with a big grader. But I maintained that driveway by myself so I could get out to work and so that my girls could get out for education and other appointments that they had for about the first 5 or 6 years we lived out there. And I think that kind of illustrate. And I mean, the house we built, I ran all the electrical. I did a whole bunch of the small carpentry work in it. And that is par for the course, right? So I find a lot of times, like I'm down here in Florida and somebody says, well, we did this or we did that. What they really mean is they used a very effective tool in their toolbox called their checkbook. And they wrote a check to a contractor and the contractor did it. Anywhere in the state of Alaska, if somebody says they did it, they did it. They built it. They put it together. They did that. So I don't think I ever felt disconnected. And I will contrast it. I was in Hawaii for Hurricane Iniki doing a bunch of disaster relief. And so we were there for over 30 days. And I mean, I love Hawaii. We used to go there on vacation all the time. But after about 21 days, I mean, I did feel like kind of cut off there, right? It's on an island. I've driven everywhere. I've snorkeled in 15 places, and it's a 5.5 to 7 hour flight, out of there. So I don't think I ever really felt disconnected in Alaska from the rest of the continental United States. I will say this, though. Our economy in Alaska was driven much differently. So a lot of times we would have an exodus out of Alaska and then sometimes you'd have this big influx. And it was almost the opposite of what was happening in the continental United States.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Let's talk about leadership, and maybe some of that upbringing and experiences also played a role in your leadership style. But do you have a leadership philosophy that you follow, or maybe it has changed or evolved over the years as your career progressed?
I would definitely say it's evolved. As I continue to get more senior and have more broad responsibilities, the two things that I found to be critical was one, faith, and two, inside of that faith that you have an example, right? An illustration. So in my case, that was Jesus Christ. So I would look at him and I would look at how he led, how he made decisions. And then inside of that, my concepts for leadership were grace, presence, and then the fact that relationships are a critical piece of the whole thing. And those he illustrated, right? I would look at what I could read mostly in the New Testament and see, how did he interact with the apostles, with the disciples? How am I going to take that and bring it into the workplace, right? Because grace is a great concept, but you also have to have accountability inside of that, right? If you've got negligence, then you have to take care of negligence. And I've always found, Danny, that grace usually leads to subordinates taking responsibility. So, and what I mean by that is we sit down and we honestly take a transparent look at what the situation was and what the challenges were and what the outcome was. And, did we see the outcome that we wanted to see, or we didn't see the outcome we wanted to see? And then why did we not see it? If when we're applying grace in that situation, and I mean basically every single decision that one of your subordinates makes or every project that they take on your behalf, they're not afraid that this is going to end their career. They know that they're responsible for it, and they know that they're going to sit down and debrief it with you, and they know that there's going to be some things that worked well, and there's going to be some things that didn't work well, and they're probably going to have executed some good judgment, and they're probably going to have executed some poor judgment. The bottom line is, though, as a leader, and you talked a lot about mentoring, this is the critical piece. If you want people to grow, you have to give them the grace to trip and fall. The example I'll give, it's kind of a rhetorical question, both to you and to the audience, but how often do you grow or learn when everything works out in your favor? I mean, I can give you my personal experience is that a lot of times I don't even remember what it was. I mean, I've had people come up to me and go, "Man, you did such a great job, man. That exercise, you were super pivotal and you did all these things." And it worked out. And so when I walked away from it, it was done, right? But man, those times where I ran into adversity, things got complicated. There was kind of some mess in there. We had to have some confrontation. Maybe we had to work out the complexities. There were expectations that weren't met. In every one of those situations, I learned, I grew, I added tools to my toolbox. And as definitely as a senior leader, that was always my goal for the folks that I worked with was, hey, I want you to continue to grow. And they're not going to continue to grow if they think every time they turn around and have a small misstep or even a big one, that they're going to get a 2x4 in the forehead, right? They need to know that you're going to receive them understanding that I'm as human as they are. And that as human beings, we make mistakes, right? And again, I go back to the example of Jesus, right? I mean, gee whiz, man, look at the apostle Peter. How many times did that guy shove his foot in his mouth over some little things? And Jesus's grace was always to correct Peter, bring him back to the path and grow him from it. And that's pretty much how my philosophy grew over time was that I need to provide that environment, a graceful environment that still has accountability in it. And then the other thing I would say, Danny, and I think I as I got more senior, probably in the last year, I found this to be the most challenging, and specifically in my peer group with other senior officers, general officers and colonels. And that was communication. What happened a lot of times was that expectations would be built without the communication to build them on. And so that's what I always found was inside of that or inside your organization, everybody would always say, well, I don't want to send you too many emails. I don't want to call you on the phone and leave a voicemail. My policy with that was I control my email. I control my telephone. I would rather have you just turn on the data full blast. And if I get to a point where I'm saturated, then I'll ask you to dial it back a little bit. And I can tell you in nearly 37 years, I never told anybody, don't send me an email. Okay, that's too much communication. And then the details in the communication. That's probably the other big thing I learned from a leadership standpoint is that, we go through a lot of training. I could give you a litany as long as your arm of the training I've had in communication. And even with that, it was so important to make eye contact. Probably one of my biggest challenges, I'm a doer. And so I would bring people into my office and I'd be like, okay, I'm listening to you, but I've got to answer these things. It took me about 8 years to break. That's a bad habit. So anybody that's listening, you stop what you're doing and you dedicate your time to the person that's sitting next to you or across the desk. You got to make eye contact. And that communication piece, you cannot effectively mentor without getting the feedback. In my world, we speak in acronyms like there's no tomorrow, right? I could have a conversation with you right now, Danny, for 10 minutes where I never spoke an English word. And you would have no idea what I was talking about, right? About strategy and how the air component works and how we connect with the other ones, right? So it's critical that the person that I'm across the aisle from, I'm getting feedback and I know that they're getting the point, right? And I'll tell you, one of my favorite things, I had a couple of subordinates and they would say at the end of our session, they're like, all right, sir, I want to do a read back. And I think this is a very Army centric thing. It's not an Air Force or an air centric thing, but I did like it. They would go down the list And I mean, it was great feedback, right, for me. And I would say that's the other thing inside the especially as I became more senior, was trying to create an environment where everybody, even that E1 out on the flight line, will give you actionable feedback. There won't just be like, "Oh, hey, it's good. We love you. We think you're great." I mean, we can go into all of those things. My mantra to those younger folks always was like, dude, don't hang me out there. I do not want to be the king walking around buck naked, right? You need to be frank with me and direct with me. And again, that goes back to that concept of grace, right? Because every once in a while, you'll get one of these youngsters, right, in your late teens, early 20s, and they'll go ahead and take advantage of it and they'll shoot it all out. And you later on, you're going to go back to their chain of command, their supervisory chain, and go, okay, tell me, what's going on here. That's the other piece of that communication part. Everybody always says there's two sides to the story. I would tell you every story is like a fine cut diamond, and it's got so many different edges and factors and variables in there. You got to do your best to go to lots of different places to put that whole story together and get the EP picture, right? Make sure that you have all the pixels in place before you start making decisions, that lead to consequences that you might or might not have intended. But that grace concept was what made those subordinate leaders that I had also comfortable, that even when I was with their youngest airmen, no matter what their airman said, I was going to be able to bring it back to them. I might not identify the airman, but we would talk about the subject, right? And then what can we do to fix it? Or maybe they didn't even know about it, right? I know 1,600 airmen doesn't seem like a lot, but I can tell you, when you're talking about guardsmen that you see sometimes only 4 days in 90 days, it's a lot of people to try to make contact with on a regular basis. And like I said, I had that in their presence, right, as one of my key pieces. That was probably one of the areas I grew in the most as well in that last 5 years. Those airmen view not just me, but the position I represent, right? And me just coming into their workplace, spending 10 or 15 minutes with them for their morale, for their worth, and for their identity, it would exponentially increase all of those things, right? It wasn't Tony, it was their wing commander. Their wing commander was interested in what they were doing. Their wing commander came and spent 10 minutes. And so I put up on my board, the first 6 months, I kind of collected data, right, when I was in the job. And so I put these things up on the board. And one of them I said is, I want to shake, at the time we had 1,492 airmen in the wing. I said, I want to shake all 1,492 hands. By year 3, I had to put a circle around that and go, this is probably impossible, because we had an attrition rate of about 165 airmen a year that would go out, and anywhere between 140 and 200 that would come in. And so, if I had shook the 165 hands that went out, that was great, but they're now gone. Now I got 200 new hands that I got to go find and I got to go shake, right? But I would encourage anybody that's doing any level of leadership that presence cannot be overstated. Your physical ability, your physical presence. You brought up in there that, I was blessed to fly airplanes for about 35 years. Because about the first 2 years I was working on airplanes, right? And that presence, it also generated confidence that I had some technical capability. I mean, but to be blunt, from the time I became a group commander to the time and all the way through being a wing command, so almost the last 10 years of my career, my job was not to implement the weapon system, right? My job was to provide for the airmen, make sure that they had resources, make sure they had direction, and that they had a box to operate in, some right and left limits. And like you pointed out, a lot of mentoring, right? Pouring into them, growing them, and connecting them, right? So I think as we come back and I put a bow on that whole thing, right? If you don't have faith as a leader, I'm not really sure how you set your compass. I mean, I know inside we all kind of know what's right and wrong, but when you have your faith, because when you get into that corner that you may or may not get out of, that's where I was turned, right? I just have to trust that the Lord has a plan. It's bigger than I am, and that will continue to move forward. And that you have to have that example. I mean, I had a lot of peers that had, different military leaders that they use as examples. That's probably fine too. I just look to Jesus because I think that, he was a stable, unchanging illustration that was exceptionally consistent. And then again, those concepts, grace, accountability, and communication, along with presence, provision, and protection, right? I didn't get into the protection piece, but it is exceptionally critical that inside your organization that you're responsible for, that your folks know that you're going to stand in front of the mat. So that goes back to that grace piece of it. So I'll give you an example. So I have a team working on a project for me, and in our chain of command, we have what's called an adjutant general, a 2-star, who runs the National Guard for the entire state. So, and in our state, he's also the emergency manager and the Homeland Security manager, right? So, very broad set of responsibilities for him. So, they're working on this project that he's given me. Things go a bit awry, and part of it came from some on my part not getting enough clarity for what the product needed to be on the end from him. And then in his case, not actually providing that clarity, right? And in a couple of cases, kind of like these change orders you might do with a contractor, right? So when we sit down, so my example of grace to the team is we sit down, we debrief the whole thing, we pulled out the good things, and then we pulled out a couple of things like, okay, so here's areas where you all could have come to me and said, hey, we're not understanding where we're going. I really need this, right? Before we get to the suspense for our big boss, right? Now, the protection piece inside of that grace is when I go to the adjutant general, he doesn't know there's a team behind me. This is all on Tony. I accept responsibility for the product that doesn't meet his expectations. And then we go through where I think I should have probably asked him deeper questions or gotten more explicit information or gotten more details, right? And I think that's critical because if I would have turned and just said, you know what, I had Joe and I had Vern and I had Stephanie on this and it just didn't work out, sir. I mean, it's going to get back to them. Inside of the Air National Guard circle, it's very tight, Danny, believe me. We always had a joke, right? If I wanted to keep a piece of information from the organization, you know, that wasn't going to happen. But when I wanted them to know something, I couldn't get it out there broad enough, right? So it would always come back. So it's just critical that, and sometimes you may have either a senior leader or a horizontal leader that might be a little bit caustic. A couple of times, like I said, we dealt with 3 combatant commanders on a daily basis. Well, they have staffs. It was not uncommon that I had to get in between, a colonel, an '06 executive officer for the 4-star that, was like, well, you guys aren't doing this for me, and I need you to do this, and I need you to do that. And, sometimes I would have to get fairly confrontational and just say, look, we're not here for you. We are here for him and his mission and what he does. Okay. Because it was an odd thing that I always found, Danny, that some of these social events where the 4-stars would come in and recognize folks for doing great things, their XOs would get over the top on the details. Like, well, we can't have more than 15 steps between Joe and Barb. And I'm like, look, man, we just need to make sure that he gets to connect with Joe and Barb. That's the important piece of this, not the PR piece. So anyway, putting a bow on that, right? Just that you've got to be able to provide and protect. The only way you can do that is with physical presence.
Thank you for sharing these stories. And before we wrap up the episode, do you have an advice that you want to share with maybe younger listeners, maybe in their early 20s, late teens, that you just want to put out there and let them know from your career, your experience?
Take advantage of as many experiences as you can, right? I mean, I am obviously a huge supporter of the Air National Guard. So the Air National Guard paid for Tony to go to college. It paid for Tony to get an airline transport pilot certificate, paid for flight instructor ratings and certificates. Yep, I have been on every continent in the world, except Antarctica. I haven't been down to Antarctica. So I would say connect yourself with something that provides you with the opportunity to have these different experiences and be a part of something that's bigger than yourself. Reach out, connect. I did allude to this before. It doesn't really matter the level of relationships, but they're the most critical things that we do as human beings is reach out and connect with other human beings. Your relationships will provide the opportunity for these different experiences. So I would encourage all the young people, man, just reach out. And there's lots of tools now, right? I mean, all this social media, connecting through Zoom. I mean, we do a Bible study weekly on Zoom. where we're connected with folks up in Alaska, right? And so that'd be my biggest recommendation. Feed those relationships, connect, and don't limit your experiences.
Great advice, and thank you for joining the show today, sir. A lot of very important lessons and pieces of advice and stories. I appreciate that, and then thank you for your time.
You're very welcome, Danny.